This isn't easy to talk about, and it has to deal with Ebola. So right now there's an Ebola epidemic that's happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and already 1,000 have passed away according to the health ministry. The DRC's Ebola outbreak began in August, and it's the second deadliest in human history. The World Health Organization Deputy Director Dr. Michael Ryan said mistrust and violence was harming efforts to tackle the disease as it spread through the east of the country. There have been 119 documented attacks on medical centers and staff since January. Health workers have plenty of vaccines. More than 100,000 people have already been given the treatment, but continuing violence in the east of the country, where militias are present, as well as mistrust of doctors, was hindering their program. They still are facing a lot of issues of community acceptance and trust. The DRC is also suffering from an outbreak of measles, which has killed more than 1,000 people, with 50,000 cases reported. The World Health Organization staff have confirmed measles in 14 of the country's 26 provinces in both rural and urban areas. Ebola is still contained within 2 provinces in the DRC, but it is becoming harder to monitor the spread of the virus because of the violence. It's good. There's a good chance, according to some of the doctors, that it could spread into some of the neighboring countries. And at least according to the map, the DRC borders 6 to 7 countries in Africa. Most Ebola outbreaks are over quickly and affect small numbers of people. Only once before has an outbreak began or had been still growing for more than 8 months after it began, and that was the West African epidemic that happened between 2013 to 2016, which killed over 11,310 people. So just a short summary about what Ebola is. It's a virus, of course. Initially causes sudden cases of fever, intense weakness, muscle pain, and sore throat. It progresses to vomiting, diarrhea, and both internal and external bleeding. People are infected when they have direct contact through broken skin or the mouth and nose with the blood, vomit, and feces of bodily fluids of someone with Ebola. Patients tend to die from dehydration and multiple organ failure. It's a frightening disease, but yet it's a disaster what's happening in the DRC, and it could potentially go across the border and to some of the neighboring countries around the DRC. So Paul and Daniel kind of want to get your thoughts.
In the West African outbreak that happened 2013 through 2016, that was a relatively major concern that hit the airwaves in a lot of the Western media is, can this be contained? Are people going to be coming into the United States with this? There were a couple of cases of doctors who had come down with Ebola who had made their way back to the United States, and there was all this consternation about how are we going to quarantine them? How do we make sure this doesn't get out? It's a highly contagious disease. And I think the fact that the World Health Organization and organizations that are trying to mitigate the spread of this disease and treat it and get vaccines out there to people are doing their darndest to just make sure that this, doesn't spread further. But in a situation like the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, where there is still a lot of militia fighting primarily over mining rights for rare earth metals, which are primarily sold to Western entities via manufacturing in China.
Can we get a wide shot really quickly?
Yeah.
This is where they're going, mostly.
Yeah.
Phones.
Yeah. Yeah, that's where, it goes to our cell phones, it goes into our computers, it goes into those things. And that kind of infighting and tribalistic sort of militia groups prevent this type of medical care from really taking hold and preventing this kind of massive outbreak in the country. So it's a disaster both for the people in the Democratic Republic of Congo and for neighboring African states, and potentially anywhere else where people would travel to, either via air travel or sea travel. Interesting that this story came up the same day I saw there's a bubonic plague outbreak in Mongolia, although they aren't as mired in these kind of militia infighting things. So the hope is that can be contained. That is somewhat less worrying than in this case, where there's a lot of destabilized population groups where almost anything can happen.
Well, as long as Mongolia doesn't get another Khan, I think we're going to be okay with the plague there, since it feeds off of dead bodies.
Yeah.
And someone was making a point in the comments, hey, is there any resources? Yeah. We're talking a lot of, tritium? Like cobalt is really big. I think is that cobalt one of the big ones?
I could be mistaken. I don't know.
Yeah. There's, again, with people talk about lithium-ion batteries, which are only going to get more and more
prevalent.
That lithium is a little bit of these batteries. A majority of them is cobalt. They're trying to stitch away, but cobalt is, I believe, only found in certain parts of Africa. And of course, as we've learned, that if the wealth of a country is primarily dug out of the ground, it's a terrible place to live, because quoting CGP, a gold mine can be run with dying slaves and still produce hefty profits. So again, this goes into Africa. Without a system of people, you can't get people educated, because as soon as people get educated in Africa, they have very little infrastructure, especially if they're medical. So they immediately fly and do work in developed nations. And it just, these cycles self-perpetuate themselves if you have this kind of a setup. And so what happens, people don't trust medicine because there's no real infrastructure for them to trust it. And like Paul said, the militia groups existing the way they do stop everything from happening. So Ebola is going to happen because pre-existing conditions, perhaps pre-existing societal conditions.
Yeah, and it's devastating to really think about, man. I only hope that there's at least enough resources where people can at least address this crisis, and more importantly, stop it before it gets out of hand.